Hello strangers, it's Thursday 18th of September and today I'm going to be telling you about the theft of Superman and Howard the Duck. Before we begin today's video, a big thank you to Marilyn for reviewing my novel Empty Nights in her last video. Marilyn, you are my new best friend and I've shared your video all over my social media. If you haven't ordered Empty Nights yet, for anyone else who's watching, please check out the link in the description below. It will be there in all future videos. And just a heads up for today's video, there is a teeny tiny Infinity War spoiler in this video. But now, let's get started with the most iconic superhero of them all, Superman. In the 1930s, DC Comics, operating under a different name, had just launched their character of Superman, and they were raking in the cash. This caused other comic book publishers to publish their own superhero characters in order to improve their own sales, and this resulted in the golden age of comic books. This competition worried DC, and they thought that children looking at comics would confuse other superhero characters with Superman and buy the wrong comic, and lower DC's profits. So DC began to sue any comic book publisher who had characters similar to Superman. And they defined similar by characters that could fly, wore a cape, had super strength, or heat vision. Now, at the time of this, DC's biggest competitor was Fawcett Publications, whose character Captain Marvel was, for a brief period, outselling Superman. Because of this, DC decided to take Fawcett to court under the claim that their Captain Marvel character was too similar to the Superman character. In the DC vs Fawcett Publications court case, Fawcett's defence was twofold. Firstly, they claimed that their character was different enough from Superman to avoid confusion among readers. Doubtful, but then again, DC's claim that children would be confused is also questionable. And two, even if Captain Marvel was too similar to Superman, there was nothing DC could do about it, because they allowed their copyright on the Superman comic book character to expire several years ago. This statement confounded DC lawyers, because at the time of the court case, they were still printing Superman comics. So they launched a full company-wide investigation. Here's what happened. For each medium Superman appeared in, he required a different trademark. If Superman was on a radio show, he needed one trademark, and if he was in a comic book, he needed a different trademark. For several years previously, DC had licensed Superman in a newspaper comic strip format to Mercure newspapers. Mercure had been publishing these Superman stories, but admins working for the newspaper had forgotten to add the copyright logo to the issues, meaning the character of Superman had been in the public domain and anyone at all could have laid claim to the character and used him. The staff at Mercure and the DC executives should have noticed this oversight, but failed to, a clear sign they weren't reading their own comics. When Fawcett claimed DC had allowed their copyright on a Superman comic book character to expire several years ago, they were technically correct. It's not clear if Mercure had allowed this slip-up to happen intentionally, so they could steal Superman for themselves and make him an exclusive Mercure character, but DC ceased publishing with Mercure and resurrected their trademark. The DC vs Fawcett Publications case was eventually resolved out of court. DC kept hold of Superman, and Fawcett had to stop publishing the Captain Marvel stories. Interesting side note, Fawcett's Publications character of Captain Marvel was no relation to the company Marvel, who later named one of their characters Captain Marvel, whose trailer dropped last week. In a plot twist worthy of a comic book, DC would later take ownership of the Captain Marvel character from Fawcett Publications and rename him Kazam, whose film is also coming out next year with Captain Marvel's. And now, Howard the Duck. Howard the Duck is a surprisingly controversial character. Howard was first created by Steve Gerber in 1973, who at the time was working for Marvel Comics. Any characters Gerber created for Marvel or under contract were the property of Marvel. Gerber took Marvel to court over his clause in his contract, feeling he had been robbed of his characters. He fought for the rights to Howard the Duck and his friends, and lost. Marvel continued publishing Howard the Duck stories, and Gerber started working at a rival comic book company called Image Comics. In 1995, 22 years after the court case, Marvel contacted Gerber and asked him if he'd like to write another Howard the Duck story for them. Gerber was very reluctant, but his boss at Image Comics persuaded him to accept the commission on the condition that the story be a crossover between the Marvel and Image comic universes. To everybody's surprise, Marvel agreed to this. Soon after starting work on the story, Gerber heard that Marvel planned to remove him as writer after a few issues and replace him with their own staff. Essentially, Marvel wanted his name on the front cover of issue 1 to sell more copies. Instead of launching into a rage that would have put the Hulk to shame, Gerber and his boss formed a cunning revenge plan. In the crossover story, Spider-Man and Howard the Duck from the Marvel Universe and Savage Dragon and Duke the Destroyer Duck from the Image Universe go to a warehouse to confront several villains, one of which is an elf with a gun. But don't worry, this story just gets stranger and stranger. Hijinks ensue until Howard the Duck ends up being cloned hundreds of thousands of times. At the end of the story, Spider-Man returns to the Marvel Universe with what he believes to be Howard the Duck, but in the Image Universe, Duke finds the real Howard, deduces that Spider-Man took a clone, and places Howard under a witness protection program with a new name and backstory. So just to recap, Howard the Duck was stolen from the Marvel Universe, moved to the Image Universe, and replaced with a clone. And because Marvel and Image Comics have both approved of the comic, it was considered official canon. You might be wondering why Marvel executives allowed Gerber to do this. To put it simply, they couldn't be bothered to read their own comic, similar to the DC writers. It wasn't until after Gerber's death in 2008 did Marvel realise they'd been robbed of a character. They retconned all Howard the Duck stories written after the crossover event, but damage was done. Reportedly, Gerber died laughing. Now, Howard the Duck is back in the Marvel Comics, and he has appeared in Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2. Howard had a scene in Infinity War, but it was cut from the final film. Good news though, it has been confirmed that Howard the Duck survived Infinity War and the Great Snappening, and I will see you all next week. Take care.